Nematology department at the University of Florida. Dr. Ellis has responsibilities in extension, instruction, and research related to honeybees. He has created a bee college down in University of Florida and the extension, and is also their version of their master beekeeper program. As an instructor, he supervises PhD and master students and has team-conducted research projects in the fields of honeybee husbandry, biology, conservation, and ecology. He also does a very nice podcast for those of you who like to listen to podcasts called Two Bees and a Podcast. So you can find that on anywhere you listen to podcasts. I've listened to it a few times. So he's a really good speaker and somebody to listen to. So we can get everything started with Dr. Ellis. Hopefully, as long as is the volume gonna work?
It looks like you're muted
Down bottom, thank you.
The University of Florida. We have about
There we go.
55,000 students at the University of Florida, and our entomology and nematology department is the largest such department in the United States. There's about 70 professors in our department, and I'm one of those. Of
Should go to full
specialty
screen, that's
honeybees.
good.
Personally, I have
We can
been a
have full
beekeeper since
screen.
the age of 12, so it's about 30 years now.
There
I
we go.
grew up in Georgia in the United States of America, and have really traveled all around the world, studying honeybees, working with honeybees, speaking to beekeepers and bee clubs all over the place. So it's really my pleasure to be able to join you guys today during your conference. So given that I'm talking about the tasks of worker honeybees, I want to share with you what I hope that you learn by the time this talk is over. My focus is to help you be able to recognize the general order of tasks that worker bees perform relative to their age, as well as identify worker bee tasks that are independent of age. In other words, I want you to know what worker honeybees do and why they do it so that you can appreciate the marvel that is the worker honeybee. And any time I start a talk about worker honeybees, I always start with this slide. And it's the most complicated slide that you're going to see in the whole presentation, but given that I'm speaking to beekeepers, I'm sure that you are all very familiar with this topic. As you all know, there are three types of bees in a honeybee colony. They are the queen, the drones, and the worker bees. Now, you know, if you look at this uppermost image here, a queen can lay an egg and she can control whether that egg is fertilized or if that egg remains unfertilized. And they can do this because when queens mate, they store the semen from the drones with which they mate in a special organ in their body. That organ is called the spermatheca. So while queen bees are laying eggs, they can elect to release semen and fertilize those eggs that are passing out of their bodies, or they can withhold semen and keep those eggs unfertilized as those eggs pass out of their body. Of course, all of you know that unfertilized eggs ultimately become drone honeybees, or the male honeybees. So male honeybees have only mothers, they have no fathers. So that's a really interesting fact about drone honeybees. They're really an interesting bee in general. And if the queen elects to fertilize that egg, it becomes a female. And that's really the limit of the control that queens have. They can produce female offspring and they can produce male offspring, but that is it. The worker honeybees then will take that female offspring and either feed it a lot of high quality food, in which case it becomes a queen, or they feed it less low-quality food, in which case it becomes a worker. So the way to think about queens and workers is queens are basically overfed workers, workers are underfed queens. Now, if I were with you face-to-face giving this presentation, there's an analogy that I like to use to explain what's happening here. Now, I want you to think about it just from a very practical standpoint. Queens have all the genes necessary to have been a worker. I mean, the workers could have made that female offspring a worker. Instead, they fed it a lot of royal jelly and it became a queen. Likewise, that same female, if they feed it a little bit, becomes a worker. So workers have all the genes necessary to be a queen. So queens could have been workers, workers could have been queens. So you have a clear example of how it's not the genes that these bees have that make them queens or workers, because they both have the same genes. Rather, it's the expression of those genes. And the analogy that I always give is, imagine that you're sitting in an auditorium, right in the very center of that large auditorium. On the left, let's say you have 5 lights from the back of the room to the front of the room, and on the right, you have 5 lights from the back of the room to the front of the room. So basically on the right side, the first light, and on the left side, the first light, are the same type of light, the same quality of light, can produce the same intensity of light, and lights 2 and 2 the same, and lights 3 and 3 all the way down to light 5. Now imagine again on both sides of the room that there is a switch for each light. So on the right side of the room, there's a switch that controls light 1, a switch that controls light 2, a switch that controls light 3, a switch that controls light 4, and one that controls light 5. And likewise, on the left side of the room, you get exactly the same switch for each of the lights. Now, imagine that I come into that room and ask you to leave that room, and you're gone for 5 minutes. And while you're gone, I go to the right side of the room and flip on switches 2 and 4, but leave off switches 1, 3, and 5. And then I go to the left side of the room and switch on switches 1, 3, and 5, but leave off 2 and 4. Exactly the opposite of what I did on the right. And I invite you back in, you return to the middle of that auditorium, and you look to the right and you look to the left, and you would say both halves of the room are lit differently, right? But the funny thing is about these halves of the room is I could have flipped those switches on and matched patterns exactly. I could have had both light switches 1 on. I could have had both sides light switches 3 on, and so forth, but I didn't. I did 2 and 4 on one side, 1, 3, and 5 on the other. Well, that, boys and girls, is exactly what happens with queens and workers. They both have the same lights. They both are otherwise capable of having the same lights on or off with the same intensity or lack thereof of each light. The difference is queens have certain lights switched on and other lights switched off, while worker bees have some lights switched off, but other lights switched on. Basically, it's not the genes that control the difference per se, it's the turning off and on of those genes that make queens and workers. And that's one of the reasons that female bees, to me, are among the most fascinating insects on planet Earth, female honeybees, that is. Because just by turning off and on switches, you get a queen bee that can live 2 years, whose most complicated behavior is to go out on a mating trip. But for the rest of her life, she only lays eggs. Whereas worker bees, they've got a huge suite of behaviors. They're capable of doing all kinds of things. But they could have been a queen. It's amazing to think about it. We call this epigenetics. The best way to teach it is, let's say again, you leave that room, that auditorium, and while you're gone, I flip on and off light switches on both sides of the room, and then I put a cover on top of those switches so that no one else can turn those on and off. They're either locked on or locked off. And epigenetics, the epi means there's something above the gene that controls the expression of the gene, just like there's a cover that controls the expression of that light switch. I flip the switch, I put a cover on it, and now it can't be controlled. Well, epigenetics happens similarly in queens and workers. There's a switch on the gene, and it's either on or off, and then you get workers or queens from the same genes, from the same female egg. All right, that's the study of epigenetics. Epi means above, so things above the genes responsible for the expression of those genes. So we got this really complex reproduction system. You've got females coming from diploid eggs or fertilized eggs. You've got males coming from unfertilized eggs or haploid eggs. And so as a result, this sex determination system is called haplodiploid sex determinant. Males are haploid, females are diploid. This is as complicated as I'm going to get in this presentation. The reason, though, that I like to start with this slide is because I really want to hammer home how amazing queen and worker bees are, given that both could have been the other. Now, this is a talk about the suite of behaviors that worker bees exhibit, but I just as easily could be giving you a talk about what queen bees do and then amaze you with the fact that both came from the same type of egg. So let's look at this a little further. When a queen lays an egg, about 3 days later, a female offspring will come out of that egg if that egg is indeed fertilized. So we get what we call larvae, right? So honeybees undergo complete metamorphosis, so you have eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults. And in this stage, you have the larval stage. They lie in the back of their cell in the shape of the letter C. Some beekeepers here call them C-shaped larvae. Other people call these larvae milk brood because they're sitting in a pool of brood food and it looks milky in appearance. So when we say C-shaped larvae or milk brood, we're talking about the youngest of larvae that honeybees undergo. From there, we get pre-pupae. That's when the larvae have finished eating. The bees will cap over their cells and those larvae will stand up, which is what you see in this image in the bottom right. So that technically is a larval stage, but it's the larval stage immediately before the pupal stage, so we call it the pre-pupal stage. They spend a couple of days as pre-pupae and then molt or shed their skin and become pupae. So you can see in the top of that bottom left image, you can see the youngest of pupae, it's still white. And as you go down that image, you see darkening pupa, and at the very bottom you get an adult bee. That, if you're a worker, will emerge from its cell 21 days after being laid. Now, it's amazing to think about honeybee development, but since this is a talk on worker bees, I want to emphasize how super cool worker bees are. So worker bees go from egg to adult while passing through a worm stage in 21 days. And when they emerge at 21 days, they are programmed and ready to perform the tasks that they were born to do. So I want to talk briefly, before I even get to the tasks of the worker bee, I want to talk briefly about honeybee development, specifically worker bee development, so that you can get a full appreciation for how amazing workers are. Because honeybees are insects, they have to shed their skin or their exoskeleton as they develop. And that's because their exoskeleton is on the outside of their body, so as they grow, they cannot grow because the exoskeleton limits their growth, so they will shed it. And that shedding of their exoskeleton is called molting. So while this table looks complicated, it's fairly simple. Basically, the life stage in column A undergoes the transformation in column B to become the life stage in column C. Now, I've told you that honeybees will shed their skin. This is true of workers as well. The period between molts is called the instar. It's the growth period of the bee before it sheds its exoskeleton. So let me give you an example of what's happening in this table. When a worker or female egg is laid, you get an egg, a larva emerges from that egg, and it is now a first instar larva. That first instar larva will eat, shed its skin or molt, and become a second instar larva. The second instar larva eats, molts, becomes a third instar larva. The third instar larva eats, molts, becomes the fourth. The fourth instar larva eats, molts, and at that molt, it becomes the pre-pupae. This is the stage that develops under the cell capping. That fifth instar larva, that larva that's standing up, the pre-pupae, it molts a fifth time and becomes the sixth instar individual, which is a pupa. Then it remains in that cap cell as a pupa, at which point, nearing its immersion as an adult bee, will shed its pupal skin. We call that eclosion. When an insect sheds its pupal skin, it ecloses, and it becomes an adult bee. So this talk is about the task of a worker honeybee, but I really wanted you to appreciate how marvelous worker bees are. These last three slides, the slide where I show you, the haplodiploid reproduction system, the images of worker honeybees progressing from egg to adult, and now talking to you specifically about what happens as they develop from egg to adult when they molt and undergo these different instar stages. What I'm just trying to do is set the stage for you to appreciate the marvel that is the worker honeybee. Now, I could be giving a similar talk for queens and drones. They undergo similar stages of development. But workers are fascinating because all of what you're seeing on this slide happens before the bee even emerges from its cell. So when we talk about the behaviors of worker honeybees, everybody simply wants to think about their behaviors as adult bees, but they undergo a lot of behavioral transformation while they're babies. They eat and grow and molt. They eat and grow and molt. They eat and grow and molt and molt and molt and so forth until they come out as an adult bee. Now, let's talk about that adult bee. You're going to notice in this presentation that I have a lot of really good images. Some years ago, I paid a PhD student in our department, Mike Bentley, who's now Dr. Mike Bentley, to take these pictures for us. He really liked photography, and he was really keen to take some images of honeybees for us so that we could use them in presentations like this one. So I hope you enjoy those images. I wanted to point them out to you because a lot of these slides will have pictures from Dr. Bentley on them, and I just wanted you to be able to appreciate them. This particular bee is particularly interesting because she is a worker bee that has the cordovan phenotype. So one genetic mutation makes it where her exoskeleton, where it would normally be brown or black, it is red. So in this particular phenotype, we get a red or incredibly light colored honeybee, all right? So worker honeybees subscribe to a system, a behavioral system that we call temporal polyethism. Temporal means time, poly means many, ethism means behavior. So temporal polyethism means timed many behaviors, all right? So honeybees exhibit reproductive division of labor. That means there's a queen that does all the reproducing while the workers do all the other tasks. And these tasks are performed in an age-related system. In fact, beekeepers, we call this age-related division of labor. Most of us don't use the words temporal polyethism unless we're in some sort of science class. But for purposes of this presentation, I wanted to introduce you to the concept of temporal polyethism and let you know that you probably know this term more as age-related division of labor. All right. So this age-related division of labor is what's going to fill the rest of this presentation. Thinking about it, explaining it, and trying to understand it. I once wrote a column for the American Bee Journal, which is one of our large national bee publications, and in that particular journal, I was writing a series of articles on honeybee behavior and biology. And I had to do a lot of research to study worker honeybee tasks. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is when in leading up to writing this particular article on honeybee tasks, I believed that every honeybee, every worker honeybee, performed every worker task throughout her adult life, and that those tasks were incredibly rigid. She progressed from one to the next in a very rigid and predictable fashion. And what I discovered when I was doing research for that article, and now that's turned into this presentation, I discovered that that is not the case. Not all worker honeybees perform all tasks. And not all worker bees perform all tasks the same amount of time. Some worker bees skip tasks. Some worker bees might even go backwards in tasks. Some worker bees may perform multiple tasks at the same age. So a lot of what follows in this discussion is going to be an overview of the standard progression of tasks and the standard ages bees are when they perform these tasks. And I want you to remember throughout that these are not rigid. They're not locked in place. And you'll understand a lot of that once I finish this presentation, because I'm going to emphasize it throughout my time with you. All right. So the tasks of worker honeybees are largely split into 4 categories: cell cleaning and capping, brood and queen tending, comb building, cleaning, and food handling, and outside tasks. And as bees age, they generally do tasks in group 1, followed by tasks in group 2, followed by tasks in group 3, and so on. This progression, their movement through these tasks, is regulated by physiology, in other words, the chemicals that they have pumping through their bodies. It's regulated by hormones, right, those chemicals through their bodies. It's regulated by the needs of the colony and environmental conditions. So collectively, physiology, hormones, pheromones, colony needs, and environmental conditions are ultimately, collectively, what help push bees through these series of tasks and helps them move to the tasks that are needed at any given point in time in the life of a honeybee colony. So probably many of you have seen this graphic from Mark Winston's 1987 book, The Biology of the Honeybee. It's a really good book, and as I've shared with you, there are 4 general broad categories of honeybee behaviors: the cell cleaning and capping behaviors, the brood and queen tending behaviors, comb building, and outside tasks. And within each of those categories, Dr. Winston shares with you the types of specific tasks that are in each of those. So for example, in the cell cleaning and capping task, they'll do some cell cleaning behaviors and some capping brood behaviors. In the brood and queen tending task, they'll tend brood and attend queens. In the comb building, cleaning, and food handling, they'll receive nectar, clean debris, pack pollen, build comb. And in the outside task, they'll ventilate the nest, guard, and forage. So I'm going to talk about all these in detail, so don't panic that I'm going through it fast. But what's most important about this graph is not only what the tasks are, but also the mean, which is the little circle, the common, and the average range of the ages of worker bees performing that task. So for example, the average or mean age of a worker bee performing the cell cleaning task is somewhere around 8 days old, right? You take that little bubble all the way down. But you'll see it's very common for workers that are 0 days old all the way to about 11 days old to perform the task. And even though it's common for them to do it in this range, a lot of workers will continue to perform this task all the way to almost 28 or so days of age. So this graphic shows you what is average, what is common, and what is the whole range of ages in which worker bees will perform that task. And generally speaking, as you move from the uppermost series of tasks to the bottommost series of tasks, you'll see that that bold bar, the one that's the common range, slowly slides to the right, showing that it's generally older and older and older and older bees that are performing that task essentially as they age. But I really wanted to explain this slide to you because to me it really does a great job explaining that plasticity I was telling you about. The fact that bees don't only perform a task at one very rigid age, that there's actually quite a range of ages that they'll perform that task and so on. So what I've done in the subsequent slides, I've gone through all of the tasks, and I've included those means and average ranges at the top of each slide so that you'll get a good indication of when bees perform a given task. So for example, from this point forward, when I talk about a honeybee behavior, I'll name the behavior, in this case cell preparation. I'll tell you the range of ages bees are when they perform that task, and I'll tell you what the average age of the worker bee is who performs that task. So they prepare cells when they are 2 to 16 days old, and the average worker bee that's preparing cells is somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 days old. All right, so I want you to keep that in mind as we progress through all the slides. So in this particular instance, we're specifically talking about cell preparation. I think you'll agree with me that that is a pretty fantastic image that Dr. Bentley provided for this picture. or for this slide. All right, so what is cell preparation? Well, there's really two subcategories. That's polishing the cell and cleaning the cell. And I know they sound like they're the same, but they're not. Both of those are used to get that cell ready for use. But polishing is the first task that occurs at this age. Cell cleaning happens later in life, and we'll get to it in subsequent slides. So hold on to that thought. So when I'm talking about cell preparation at the youngest of age, I'm specifically talking about polishing cells as a subsection of cell preparation. All right, so in this behavior, the worker bees go to the very back of the cell and go from the back to the front, removing anything left over from previous cell occupants. That might be pupal cocoons, excretia, so they're waste. They might be patching the walls of the cell with wax, etc. So they're essentially taking the debris out of used cells in an attempt to get those cells ready for future use. Remember, pupal cocoons would be that little bit of silk that the larvae spin when they're ready to pupate. Most people don't know this, but honeybee larvae actually produce silk. Not in the quantities that, say, a butterfly or a moth would produce, but they still produce it, and that is one of the reasons that the cells darken over time. So when a bee emerges from a cell, the bees that are engaged in polishing subtask of cell preparation will go in and start removing those pupal cocoons, and that excretia includes waste, and it also includes the old exoskeletons that the larvae and the honeybees shed when ultimately maturing and becoming an adult bee. So those bees that are polishing cells have a very important task. All right, the next task that they perform is cell capping. The reason this is usually a second task is worker bees are not born with the ability to start producing wax instantly. Their wax glands are not fully developed. So it takes a couple of days for their wax glands to develop, but once they do, the young worker bees can start to secrete that wax in very small amounts. And what they'll do is they'll use that wax to cap over the cells of the developing larvae. Those larvae that are finished feeding, that are about to become pre-pupae, these young workers will begin to secrete tiny amounts of wax and use leftover wax to start capping over those cells. Interestingly enough, it can take somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 minutes to 6 hours to cap a single cell, depending on the number of workers working on that cell, as well as the amount of wax that they are able to produce at the time that they are capping over that cell. The next task that worker bees will find themselves performing is feeding larvae, and they tend to feed larvae when they're about 3 to 15 days old and an average of 10 days. The workers that perform this task are called nurse bees, and the reason that workers can't be born and instantly begin to feed larvae is that they have to develop their glands necessary to produce brood food. Worker bees have 2 sets of glands in their heads that they use to secrete the components of brood food. That includes the hypopharyngeal glands and the mandibular glands. So essentially, when a worker bee is born, she begins eating pollen in order to develop her hypopharyngeal and mandibular glands appropriately. And once she has those adequately developed, they can begin to produce brood food. That's why they don't come right out of the cell and start doing this instantly. They've got to develop those food-producing glands. Once they do have those glands developed, they're able to secrete those food components, and then they're able to feed the larvae. So the adult nurse bees are the ones who decide when to feed larvae and what proportional mix of brood food to feed based on the age of those larvae. For example, as a worker or a queen larvae or a drone larvae ages, the components of their diets change. So nurse bees, when they visit those open cells and determine how old that larva is and the nutritional requirements that that larva has, can change the proportion of secretions from hypopharyngeal and mandibular glands to produce the food that is relevant or important for the age of larva that they are feeding. What's interesting in this regard is that larvae, as they develop, may have their cells visited 5,000 plus times, with them being fed somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 2,000 of those times. So those larvae, worker larvae especially, are provisioned incrementally. They're given food in small amounts over time. So you can imagine then that those workers who are responsible for feeding larvae have a daunting task in front of them. They spend quite a lot of time when their heads and cells spitting up food for the developing offspring. The next task that worker bees do or perform while they are developing is they tend to the queens. They usually do this when they're about 3 to 14 days old, and usually are on average of about 11 days old when they do this. This task is usually performed around the same time they're feeding brood, and that's because a lot of the same behavioral characteristics that these workers need to have, they use when feeding brood. All right, so worker bees will form a circle around the queen. We call this circle a retinue. They're attracted to the queen by her pheromones, and they will lick the queen, they'll groom the queen, they'll feed the queen, and they'll examine her with their antenna and foreleg. So all of this allows them to pick up the pheromones of the queen, distribute those pheromones to nearby workers, who distribute it to nearby workers, who distribute it to nearby workers, and essentially pass the pheromones of the queen around the nest, which tells all the workers in the nest that we have a queen present, life is good. So these bees, even though they seemingly have an unimportant task, actually have an incredibly important task, because part of what they do is share with the hive that we have a queen, life is good. And furthermore, they take care of that queen, who is that important bee needed to produce all the offspring in the nest. Next, you get workers that are involved in honey production. These workers are 10 to 20 days old. They are on average around 13 days old. Now, one of the beliefs I had when I was a new beekeeper is that bees that are nectar foragers go out and collect nectar from flowers and fly it back to their hives, and when they get to the hive, they'll go to find an empty cell and spit up that nectar into those cells. Well, that is not the case. There is actually a cohort of worker bees, the honey producers, whose job it is to meet the incoming nectar foragers at the nest entrance. So these bees will actually be waiting just inside the nest entrance for those nectar foragers to arrive. And once those nectar foragers arrive, these bees will take that nectar from those nectar foragers, so the nectar foragers can turn around and go right back out. And these bees then will take that nectar and take it to the cells where it needs to be deposited. But before these workers deposit that nectar in cells, they will start the conversion of that nectar from nectar to honey by starting the evaporation process. And they do this by blowing nectar bubbles. So they basically spit out the nectar and suck it back in. They spit it out and they suck it back in. They spit it out and they suck it back in. They spit it out and suck it back in. And they do this for about 20 minutes, and then they put it into the cells. And basically during that time, they've added some enzymes, they've started the dehydration process, and they're basically pushing that nectar in the direction of becoming honey. When bees graduate from that task, they usually move on to cleaning cell debris. Bees that are cleaning cell debris usually are in the neighborhood of 11 to 15 days old, and that mean age is around 14 days old. So these workers are the ones who remove debris from the hive. That will include spoiled pollen, it'll include wax, it'll include dead brood and dead bees. These are the undertakers, as it were. These are the same workers that exhibit hygienic behavior. These are the ones that are able to detect diseased brood under capped cells, uncap those cells, and remove that diseased brood from the nest. So clearly this cohort of bees, the ones that are performing this task, have a very important function in the overall health and homeostasis in the nest. Next, you get the pollen handling bees. And these bees are not the ones that are going to collect the pollen. It's kind of reminiscent of the nectar handlers. These aren't the ones going to collect the nectar, they just meet the bees at the nest entrance to collect nectar from them and run them to the combs. Here, the pollen handlers are not the ones that go collect pollen, they're the ones that process it. However, for the nectar handlers met the nectar foragers at the nest entrance. In the case of pollen foragers, the pollen foragers are the ones who go and deposit the pollen in cells. Here you can see a pollen forager with the pollen on her hind legs. She's checking out this cell to determine that it's a cell that she wants to deposit pollen into, and what she determines that's what she wants to do, she'll back her hind legs up to that cell and knock those pollen balls off of her hind legs into those cells. After she has knocked that pollen off of her hind legs into those cells, that is when the pollen handlers take over. These bees will then go and take those little pellets that the pollen foragers collected, and they'll start to pack those pellets into the cells until you get these smooth pollen-packed cells, just like what you see in the image in the bottom left. All of these cells have been processed by the pollen handlers. They're the ones who start the conversion of that pollen from pollen to bee bread. Following this, worker bees might engage in a behavior called comb building. They typically are 12 to 23 days old when they do this and are on average around 16 days old. At about 12 days after emerging, the workers' wax-producing glands have fully developed. So the reason they can't really engage in comb building behavior earlier is that they're just simply unable to produce copious amounts of wax. Remember, I mentioned earlier they can produce small amounts of wax, which allows them to deposit, to cap over brood cells, etc. But now, at this age, they're able to produce copious amounts of wax and then use that wax to build comb. We all know that these wax glands are located on the underside of the abdomen. They'll secrete these sheets of wax, just like you see in this image, and they'll remove those little scales of wax, chew them with their mandibles, and fashion it into the six-sided combs with which we are all familiar. After that, when they're somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 25 days old, for an average of about 13 days, the workers will move to that second phase of cell cleaning. Remember, the first thing they do is clean cells, but from the polishing perspective. Now they're cleaning it from another perspective. So these workers will use their mandibles to restore and smooth cells, remove the cell cappings, and prepare the cell for future use. It can take them around 30 minutes to clean a cell when they're this age, and it usually is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 30 workers helping prepare that cell. So you get the young cleaning behavior, which is where they're polishing the cell, and now you get the older cleaning behavior where they're smoothing the cell and making its final preparations necessary for that cell to be occupied either by nectar or pollen or an egg. At this point, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 25 days old, for an average of about 19 days, the workers transition from behaviors that occur inside the nest to behaviors that occur outside of the nest. And the first behavior that you typically find them engaged in outside of the nest is ventilating the nest. There's a very characteristic ventilating the nest posture, where the bees will stick their abdomens up in the air like you see here. They're raised really high. The back end of their bodies is raised really high up in the air. They'll push their back forelegs up really high, and they'll be ventilating that nest by fanning their wings. You can see this bee in an incredibly characteristic pose. This bee here is doing the same thing. It's almost like they're in the beginning stages of a push-up, where they've lowered the front half of their body down, but then they just get stuck there while they fan their wings. So these bees can either point towards the nest or away from the nest, and controls, therefore, the direction that the air passes either into or out of the nest. So this ventilating allows them to cool the nest, and it also allows them to evaporate a lot of the moisture from the honey or from the nectar that they are trying to ripen. Hundreds of worker bees can perform this task at any given time. Next, you get my favorite image that Mike Bentley took. he took a picture of guard bees, and after ventilating, bees typically move into the guard bee behaviors. They're usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 28 days old when they do this, for a mean of 19 days. And just like the ventilators had a very characteristic pose, the guard bees have an even more characteristic, dare I say, menacing pose. And in this pose, their hind forelegs are low to the ground, and their front two legs are in the air, and their mandibles are open. So you see this bee very characteristically doing it. This bee is doing it as well. This other bee is a little bit out of focus is doing it. And so basically these guard bees sit at the nest entrance, and when another bee lands and walks by them, they will kind of reach out towards that bee and antenate with it. They'll rub their antenna on that bee and determine if that bee is friend or foe. If it's foe, it gets attacked. If it's friend, it's allowed into the nest. Now when bees are somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 27 days old, somewhere around an average of about 23 days, the workers will begin to transition to foraging-based tasks. And this will begin with short orientation flights. Remember, these workers haven't left their nest. They don't know where their nest is in relation to the rest of the world. So they'll start taking very short circular flights around the entrance of the nest and then land back on the entrance. And then they'll fly a little bit further away and then land back on the entrance of the nest. And then they'll fly further away still and then land back on the entrance of the nest. And so they go back and forth, gradually expanding their flight area until they get comfortable knowing where their nest is relative to other landmarks in the environment, trees, ponds, etc., or bodies of water. So these orientation flights tend to occur on warm, windless, sunny afternoons, and they can be incredibly intense. In fact, a lot of people who walk by their hives who see an orientation flight get instantly overwhelmed because they think their colonies are on the verge of swarming, when it's usually just an orientation flight where hundreds or sometimes even thousands of bees have finally graduated to the task that will take them outside of the nest, and they're just trying to figure out how to fly and where home is. The final kind of rigid or semi-rigid task that worker bees will find themselves doing is foraging. They're usually in the neighborhood of 18 to 28 days old, or an average of 24 days when they perform this task. This is the task that will kill the bee. If they've survived this far, this is the task that they will do dying, or die doing. All right, so on average, a worker honeybee will forage for about 4 to 5 days and cover somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 miles. And so that seems to be the flight capacity of a worker. After they've hit this, their wings are tattered, their bodies are worn, and they just no longer have the energy to continue performing this task. So we refer to these workers as foragers, and when they leave the nest, they are collecting one of 4 things: nectar to convert to honey, pollen to convert to bee bread, water that they sprinkle around the nest and evaporate off for thermoregulation purposes, and plant rosins, which we affectionately know as propolis. So they're going out to collect nectar, pollen, water, or plant rosins. And once they've collected one of these things, here you've got a worker bee collecting nectar. You can see her tongue extended into the bottom of the flower here. In the image in the upper right, you've got a bee who's collected pollen. You can see the pollen on her hind leg. Of course, the bee in the image on the bottom is collecting water. You know she's on water because you can see the reflection in the water from her standing in a very shallow pool of water. And once they've collected these things, they'll go back and communicate information about these forage resources to their sisters in recruitment dances. And with these dances, they're able to communicate location, distance, and the quality of the source relative to the sun and the nest site. Now, what I've given you so far are some rare, fairly predictable tasks that worker bees perform, more or less, as they age. There are some assorted tasks that worker bees can find themselves engaged in, and a lot of these are independent of age. Some of them are age dependent. You'll see an example in a moment, but some of them are independent of age. In other words, a wide range of ages of worker bees might be engaged in these behaviors. So some of these other behavioral tasks include what we call bearding. Every summer when it gets hot in Florida, I'll get dozens of emails and phone calls from brand new beekeepers who are so concerned about this huge cluster of bees that's hanging on the face of their hive. What's going to happen? Are they swarming? What's happening? And that's just bearding behavior. You can see in this image a really small beard, just tiny, more like a stubble, as it were. But the reason we call it bearding behavior is it looks like a beard on the face of that hive. So bearding is probably, we think it's a way to avoid overheating the nest during summer, during the warm months. So the bees that are otherwise have no task to perform will leave the nest so that the inside of that nest does not overheat while the bee colony is trying to rear brood. Thermoregulation, we know, we've already talked about the fact there are water foragers. There are also ventilator bees. So the bees that perform the cooling of the nest are a fairly predictable age. However, in winter, when it gets incredibly cold in some places and bees start to warm the hive, that kind of temporal polyethism breaks down a bit. So worker bees can also participate in the warming of the nest during fall and winter. And that's a very complex behavior where they will unhinge their wings from their flight muscles and shiver those muscles that generates heat. And you get lots of bees doing this simultaneously that can raise the nest temperature to a temperature necessary to keep the brood warm or keep the bees sufficiently warm so that they don't die themselves. They will go into empty cells. They will go between frames just to make a very contiguous and consistent cluster. The behavior is so complex that the bees on the outside of the cluster oftentimes get too cold to move. So the bees inside the cluster will pull the bees on the outside of the cluster into the cluster to warm up and then take their place. So it's a very complex behavior, is warming the colony. It's funny because they cool and warm the colony two completely different ways, right? For cooling the colony, they collect water and they fan their wings. For heating the colony, they cluster tightly and shiver their flight muscles. But nevertheless, these series of behaviors allows them to thermoregulate the nest. Some workers can lay eggs. We of course call these laying workers. There are times when a colony will go hopelessly queenless and the bees fail to make a queen for whatever reason. When that happens, some of the workers' ovaries may develop, and when that occurs, those workers can begin to lay eggs, but workers don't have a spermatheca. They cannot mate, so they cannot fertilize eggs. So when workers become laying workers, they can only produce unfertilized eggs or drones. So a colony that's headed by laying workers is doomed because drones are otherwise useless in this regard. It can't perform the tasks of the hive, so the colony is doomed. People believe that laying workers is a phenomenon in the first place because the colony is doomed, and so this is their last ditch attempt to get their genetics into the environment. Some worker bees engage in what we call patrolling behavior, where they're simply behaviorless. At the moment, they are taskless, I guess is a better term. They're taskless, they don't have a specific task that they're performing, and instead they're patrolling, trying to understand the feedback loops to determine what is needed at that moment. What is it that they need to do? What task is underperformed that needs to be addressed? All workers, after about a day or two old, are capable of participating in a defensive response. Generally speaking, it's the guard bees at the nest entrance that will initiate this defensive response, but all worker bees are capable of engaging in it. If you've ever gotten a colony really hot before and elicited a significant defensive response, workers across the age spectrum are participating in attacking you and stinging you. I just thought I would throw this image into this presentation just to give you a full-scale appreciation for how beautiful the stinger is of a worker in the first place. In fact, probably after all of you hear me talk about this slide, you're going to want to run out and have yourself stung just so you can see this stinger in all of its glory. But in this image on the left, are the venom glands. These glands are the ones that produce the venom. They release their venom into B, which is the venom sac. It holds the venom in storage until use. C is a muscular bulb that when you get stung, the muscles contract and pump the venom from B through the muscles and through the sting shaft D into your body. So A is where the venom's produced, B is where the venom's stored, C is what pumps the venom, and D is what delivers it straight to the point of contact. In the image in the upper right, A, B, and C are the parts of the sting shaft. D is the part of the shaft that comes really high that responds to the contraction of the muscle. When this side of the muscle contracts, it forces this part of the shaft further into your body. Then when this side of the muscle contracts, it forces its part of the shaft further into your body. So as you are stung and that muscular bulb beats, basically it's working this sting shaft further and further and further into your body. One of the funny things about worker bees that most people do not know is that they actually spend the vast majority of their time not working at all. They actually spend the vast majority of their time resting. Everybody says as busy as a bee. That's one of those sayings that we all use. We want our employees to be as busy as a bee. We want our kids at school to be as busy as a bee. But you actually don't want them to be as busy as a bee, because the vast majority of the time the workers are resting. In fact, if we call them by what they do most, we call them resters and not workers. And the reason people don't see that is when you pull out a frame from your hive, your eyes are instantly drawn to the moving bees, not the ones standing still. The next time you work your colonies, I want you to look at a frame and see how many workers are actually resting. Another assorted task is robbing. During certain times of the year, especially during nectar dearth, some bees will exhibit robbing behavior where they stop foraging and begin to try to steal resources from other colonies. In the image in the bottom left, these workers are trying to steal it from a feeder jar, but they can also work their way into the entrance of a hive or through the cracks and crevices of another colony's hive to try to steal resources from typically weakened hives. Worker bees also engage in grooming behavior, which is where they lick and comb themselves, as well, whereas in addition to siblings, they'll clean one another. They also engage in trophallaxis, which is a very fancy way to say that they feed one another. Basically,